Hello again, it's me, Jack Van Breen from Guitar Showcase in San Jose, California, talking some more about some cool gear here on Totally Guitars. I'm holding one of my favorite styles of guitars, the Gibson L-5. It's kind of the creme de la creme of the large archtop guitars. There are other instruments out there people speak of reverently, but you don't see them very often, like D'Angelico's, D'Acquistos. The list goes on. Those luthiers, when they were in their heyday, some are still doing it, will build a guitar every 2 or 3 years. But the L5 is fairly common. It's characterized by a fairly thick body. It has a top that's carved out of a solid piece of wood. It's not bent. So they start with a fairly thick chunk of wood and will shave it down until they have the proper arch. Back and sides are usually maple. Usually, I've never seen one that isn't. And it's a fairly large box. These guitars were developed in the 30s and 20s and enhanced in the 40s because they were acoustically played. They were made of big guitar, so you could play it in an orchestra. Doing that kind of stuff. And clearly, this isn't really going to be loud enough to keep up with an orchestra, which is why they invented pickups to be put on the guitar to make the guitars louder. But originally, this is all they had. This particular copy of the L5 is kind of unusual. It started life out, as near as we can tell, and I've had this corroborated by Danny. I can't remember Danny's last name. He's an amazing guitarist who happens to be our Gibson rep. That this guitar started out life as an acoustic-only instrument. It didn't have the pickups, didn't have the controls. They just built it so you could play it acoustically, which is kind of sweet. Because of that design, it had slightly different bracing than the electrical models, because when they added the electronics, they had to move some of the braces around internally to make room for the pickups. But anyway, this guitar started out as an acoustic instrument, and I don't know if we can zoom in right here to the joint here. At some point, evidently, somebody had added what they called the Johnny Smith pickup. It's the little tiny humbuckers that you see on some of the earlier Epiphones and the ubiquitous Les Paul Deluxe of the early 70s. But they didn't like that so much. So they determined they didn't much care for the tone, evidently, of the small humbucking pickup. They tend to be fairly bright and reedy unless you turn them all the way up, and even then they're pretty thin sounding. And so somewhere along the path, the owner of this instrument, or one of the owners, decided they wanted to have the dual humbucking configuration that you mostly see on L5s. So they or somebody they hired cut some holes in the top here and mounted these humbuckers. And you'll notice that this pickup ring here on the neck pickup, it comes out fairly far into the body. My only guess, because I haven't actually taken this apart to look at, is that somebody slipped and went farther in the cutting than they had anticipated, so they covered it up. The other thing that's unusual about this instrument is you'll notice that there's no fret markers on the fretboard. You can't see from there. It's tough to see radiuses when you're holding a guitar, but this has a much flatter radius than the L5 typically has. And again, I believe one of the owners thought it would play better for them if they shaved the fretboard down, and in doing so took off those lovely block inlays that we like on the L5. So this guitar has had lots of modifications to it. It is the farthest thing you can get to from being factory as is possible and still be an L5. So what that does for us is this is a a mid-60s. We think it's a 64 to 66, somewhere in there, L-5. If this instrument had come from the factory with a properly installed pickup, it would probably be anywhere between $10,000 to maybe $15,000 worth. Probably closer to 10 because this one has been well loved. You can see lots of buckle rash, etc. So call it $10,000. But because it's not factory, it's been modified and in some ways not very successfully, this guitar is actually only worth about $4,000, maybe $5,000. Interestingly enough, one of my pet peeves is people buy guitars because they read the specs. They see somebody else playing one. It's a rare customer I get that comes in and goes, wow, I like the way this guitar plays and sounds. And then thinks about whether it's a Gibson or a Fender or an Ibanez or whatever. They're more interested in the musicality of the instrument. And I'm very arrogant about that. I think it's more important to get an instrument that plays and sounds great than is perfectly clean or factory fresh or any of the other things that will stop somebody from acquiring an instrument that really gives voice to their musicality. Everybody who picks this guitar goes, wow, this is great. But they all are looking for the $15,000 variant that's just fresh in the case, new old stock, as you will. And so this guitar is still looking for a home. I checked my numbers this morning. I didn't win the lotto, so I can't take it home. But if I do, you'll be too late. Anyway, Jack Van Breen from Guitar Showcase in San Jose for Totally Guitars. Thank you for paying attention for a little bit.